Everyone celebrates Sarah's miracle. Almost no one talks about the woman she sent away after it. And this is where the beautiful version starts to crack. The story is usually remembered as a happy ending, years of waiting, an impossible promise, a son born when nobody expected it anymore, a woman who laughed at the impossible and then saw the impossible living inside her own house. It sounds complete, almost suspiciously complete. Because before the promise arrived, that house was already full of decisions nobody had properly resolved. Hagar did not appear from nowhere. Ishmael did not appear from nowhere. The tension did not appear from nowhere. All of it began when waiting became too heavy, and someone tried to accelerate what had not happened yet. Sarah had heard the promise. Abraham had heard it too. There would be a son. There would be a future. There would be descendants. There would also apparently be a very long pause. Years passed and nothing changed. Sarah grew older. Abraham grew older. The promise remained exactly where it had always been, somewhere ahead, refusing to provide a schedule. And waiting without a schedule is where human creativity becomes dangerous. Sarah looked at the situation and created an alternative. Hagar, her Egyptian servant, would have a child with Abraham. The family would have an heir. The future would move forward. Everyone could stop staring at the calendar, because trying to help an impossible promise with an improvised family arrangement always produces peace, obviously. At first, Hagar entered the story as a solution. Then, she became pregnant, and the solution became permanent. Sarah had wanted an answer to the waiting. What she received was a new relationship inside the house, one with its own loyalties, wounds, and future. A temporary solution had become a permanent human reality. And permanent human realities are rarely impressed by the original desperate plan that created them. The plan now had a face. The shortcut had a heartbeat. The decision made under pressure was walking through the house. It was like creating a backup plan in desperation, and then wanting to erase the person who became the consequence of that plan. That was the part the beautiful version preferred to skip. The problem was not only the promise. It was what remained inside the house while the promise took too long. Hagar remained, the pregnancy remained, the comparison remained, the resentment remained, and eventually Ishmael remained. By the time Isaac was born, the miracle did not arrive in an empty house. It arrived in a house where the past was already sitting at the table. Sarah finally received what she had waited for, but the promise did not rewind the years. It did not undo the decision. It did not remove the people created by that decision. And it did not make the tension disappear simply because everyone now had something to celebrate. The miracle was real. So was the shortcut. And the promise did not erase the shortcut. The conflict did not begin when Hagar was sent away. It began when waiting became unbearable. Before Isaac was born, there was pressure. Too much time, too much shame, too much expectation, too much silence. A promise too big for a reality that seemed too late. Sarah was not dealing only with delay. She was dealing with the pain of waiting for something that seemed impossible. The promise sounded clear. Her life did not. Year after year, nothing changed. The future had been announced, but the present kept looking exactly the same. And there are only so many years a person can hear, "Just keep waiting," before waiting starts to feel less like faith and more like being forgotten. Sarah watched time pass. She watched her body age. She watched the promise remain somewhere ahead, with no date, no explanation, and apparently no interest in making anyone comfortable. And when waiting starts to hurt, the shortcut starts to look like wisdom. That was how Hagar entered the story. Not as an enemy, not as a threat, not as the woman Sarah would later send away. She entered as a solution. Sarah looked at Hagar, looked at Abraham, and created a plan that could move the future forward. Hagar would have a child with Abraham. The family would have an heir. The waiting would finally produce something visible, because trying to accelerate a promise with an improvised solution always ends in family peace. Obviously, the plan worked. Hagar became pregnant, and then everything changed. She was no longer only a servant carrying out someone else's arrangement. She was carrying the child Sarah had wanted for herself. The balance inside the house shifted immediately. Sarah felt exposed. Hagar saw her position differently. Abraham stood between them and contributed exactly the amount of clarity expected from a man who had agreed to the entire plan. Almost none. What had looked practical now felt personal. It was like trying to solve a crisis with one quick decision, and then discovering that the decision had become a permanent part of the house. The problem was not lack of promise, it was anxiety trying to control the promise. Nobody called it fear because the plan looked practical. Sarah had not stopped wanting the future God had described. She had simply decided that waiting for it was no longer enough. So she tried to manage the result herself. But human solutions, when born from pressure, almost always charge interest. And this one charged quickly. The house now carried comparison, resentment, humiliation, and fear. Hagar had entered as the answer to Sarah's pain, but once the answer became visible, Sarah could no longer separate it from everything she felt she had lost. The conflict was not created when Isaac arrived. Isaac would only expose what was already there. The crack began much earlier, when silence became unbearable, control started looking practical, and a desperate solution was invited into the family. And then the solution started to become uncomfortable. Then Isaac is born, and what should have ended the pain begins to expose the crack. Everything changes. The promised son is finally there. The waiting is over. The impossible has happened. Sarah, who once laughed at the idea, now holds the child everyone thought would never come. For a moment, the story looks complete. Abraham celebrates. Sarah laughs. The household has its miracle, but the arrival of the promise does not automatically remove the consequences of the shortcut. Hagar is still there. Ishmael is still there. The earlier story is still breathing inside the house, and that makes everything uncomfortable, because Sarah now has what she waited for, but she also has to look at the living reminder of the years when she tried to solve everything her own way. Isaac represents the promise, Ishmael represents the plan, and both boys are now growing under the same roof, which is usually how unresolved family tension becomes much easier. Nothing says peace like two futures competing in one household. The birth of Isaac did not create the conflict. It only made it impossible to pretend that it did not exist. Sometimes, victory does not erase insecurity. It only reveals where insecurity was still hiding. Sarah finally receives what she wanted most, yet the arrival of Isaac does not make her feel entirely safe. Instead, it makes the stakes clearer. There is now an inheritance. There is now a future. There is now something Sarah believes must be protected. And Ishmael is no longer just Hagar's son. In Sarah's eyes, he is connected to Abraham's future, the household's power, and everything Isaac is supposed to receive. It is like finally getting what she wanted, and realizing that the decision she made in desperation is still sitting at the table. The promise arrived. The emotional mess also confirmed attendance. A miracle can change the future without cleaning up the past. Sarah has proof that the promise was real, but proof does not automatically produce peace. Instead, every celebration places Isaac beside the history that came before him. The happier the moment becomes, the harder it is to ignore who else is still inside the frame. During a celebration for Isaac, Sarah sees Ishmael laughing. The text is brief, but Sarah's reaction is not. Whatever she sees in that moment, she does not treat it as harmless. She sees competition. She sees a threat. She sees the past reaching toward Isaac's future. The house had carried the tension for years. Now the promise gives that tension a visible target. Isaac did not cause the fear. His arrival exposed it. Sarah looks at Hagar and no longer sees only the woman who helped produce an heir when the promise seemed late. She sees the reminder of the shortcut. She sees the mother of Abraham's other son. She sees someone standing too close to the future she had waited so long to receive. And then Sarah looks at Hagar and sees more than a woman. And here the promise stops being only a celebration. It becomes a fight over space. Sarah sees Hagar, she sees Ishmael, she sees the tension, and she sees what all of it might mean for Isaac's future. The house is no longer holding one complicated past. It is now holding two sons, two mothers, one inheritance, and absolutely no chance that everyone will interpret the situation calmly. So Sarah makes the decision that defines the title. She sends Hagar away. This is the part many versions soften too much. It is not simply family organization. It is not merely two paths separating. It is not a tidy solution to an unfortunate problem. It is a woman receiving the promise and then trying to remove from the house the consequence of the years when she could not wait. That is why this scene matters. Sarah is not looking only at Hagar. She is looking at everything Hagar represents: the shortcut, the humiliation, the comparison. The fear that Isaac's future may not feel as secure as Sarah wants it to feel. This is not only jealousy, it is promise mixed with fear. Sarah received the son who once seemed impossible, and still acted as though the promise needed to be protected by expelling another woman, a deeply confident response to divine certainty. Sarah tells Abraham to send Hagar and Ishmael away. Abraham is distressed, which is understandable considering Ishmael is also his son, and the entire arrangement did not happen without his enthusiastic participation. Now everyone has discovered that decisions made together can somehow become one person's problem later. The command is severe. Hagar is not being moved to another room. She is not being given a fresh start nearby. She is being removed from the household, pushed away from the place where the entire crisis began. It is like finally winning, and still trying to erase the person who remembers the crooked road to the victory. The famous scene is not the beginning. It is the evidence caught in public. The promise arrived. But the house was still full of things the promise did not automatically fix. Sarah's fear had not disappeared. Abraham's responsibility had not disappeared. Hagar's humanity had not disappeared. And Ishmael's existence had certainly not disappeared, simply because Isaac was now the promised son. Yet the solution Sarah chooses is removal. Take the reminder out of the house, move the tension beyond the walls, protect the future by pushing the past into the wilderness. The problem, of course, is that consequences do not stop existing just because they are no longer visible from the doorway. The wilderness did not erase the history. It only made the cost easier for the household to avoid watching every day. Sarah had once brought Hagar into the plan because the promise seemed too slow. Now she pushed Hagar out because the promise finally felt too valuable to risk. And Hagar paid the price for a decision that did not begin with her. Sarah received the promise, but the promise did not erase what she did to Hagar. That is the center of the story. She waited, she doubted, she tried to solve the problem herself. She received the impossible, she celebrated the promise, and then she sent away the woman who carried the consequence of the shortcut. The story does not minimize Sarah's pain. Years of waiting had shaped her. Shame had pressed on her. Fear had followed her into the moment that should have felt safest. But her pain did not become permission to discard Hagar. That is the uncomfortable human part. Sometimes a person finally receives what they wanted most, and still acts from the fear of losing it. Sarah had Isaac. She had the promise in her arms. She had the future she had spent years believing might never come. And still, fear told her that the future was not safe while Hagar and Ishmael remained nearby. So she tried to protect the promise by removing the people connected to the shortcut. A flawless strategy, if the goal was to make the consequences disappear from view rather than actually face them. Receiving a promise does not mean every earlier decision disappears. Some decisions still have to be confronted. A miracle can confirm that God kept the promise without confirming that every human choice along the way was wise. Blessing does not rewrite history, and celebration does not cancel responsibility for who was already hurt. It is like moving into a new house and discovering that the old cracks came with the furniture. The location changes. The walls look different. The cracks remain. The promise was real. The fear was real too. And when Sarah tried to secure the future by pushing Hagar out of the scene, the story revealed something Sarah could not control. God still saw Hagar. The household could send her away. The family could remove her from the center of the story. Sarah could treat her like a problem that needed distance, but Hagar did not become invisible. In the wilderness, when her resources ran out and the future looked closed, God heard Ishmael and responded. That does not erase the harm. It does not turn the expulsion into a beautiful decision. It shows that the person the household pushed outside the frame was still inside God's sight. Sarah's miracle remained a miracle. Her fear remained her responsibility. And Hagar's suffering did not become less important simply because Isaac carried the promise. That is why the story cannot be reduced to one woman receiving a son. It is also about another woman being used as a solution, treated as a threat, and sent away when her presence became uncomfortable. Sarah received the promise, but Hagar still paid the price, and yet the final word did not belong to the house that rejected her. Sarah received the promise, but Hagar was still seen by God. Which misunderstood biblical story should be simplified next? Leah, Rachel, or Rebekah?